Good morning to one and all. Welcome to an hour-long lecture on T.S. Eliot. We're going to look at two of his major poems, Gerontion and Journey of the Magi. But in order to do that, we should have to place him in a particular time and place. My dear students, you know that T.S. Eliot is one of the most important voices of 20th century. What did he do that made him such an important name, that gave him such an important place? I'm sure all of you know that he was not merely a poet. He was a critic and he was a dramatist too. T.S. Eliot, Thomas Sterne Eliot. Let us look at the age in which he lived, the 20th century. First slide, please. He lived from 1888 to 1965. 20th century remembers him with great pride and concern. In fact, in the beginning of the century, when he began writing, that is in the second decade and the third decade, of course he continued to write till the 1950s. To be able to write like Eliot was the aim, ambition, hope, desire of each poet. He had set a standard which every poet wanted to understand, to be able to imitate in order to be accepted and appreciated. In order to understand the poetry of the 20th century, let us first look at the characteristics of the 20th century. The 20th century was a total breakaway from the Victorian age. I'm sure, my dear students, you do know that each age is in a sense a reaction against the previous age. So if the 20th century is a breakaway from the Victorian age, we must quickly try and remember the characteristics of the Victorian age. The Victorian age was one of authority. The Victorian age was one of compromise. What happens to 20th century? What is the change? Suddenly, there is a mood of pessimism. There is a mood of skepticism. There is a mood of uncertainty. Literature cannot move away from the society in which it lives, in which it is born, in which it thrives. Literature is a product of the social, political, and economic conditions of that particular age, of that particular country. Do you remember what happened from 1914 to 1919, and again from 1939 to 1944? The two world wars which shattered human faith in humanity. Eliot was a product of this age, and therefore there was a sense of pessimism in all that he wrote. But before I come to Eliot, let us once again look at the characteristics of the age. There was a voice of authority, the voice of the expert. He wanted to be heard, and he spoke loud and clear. The two world wars I've already mentioned. This was also the age of interrogation, of questioning, not of silent acceptance, but of questioning everything around us. You know that this is what further on in the century led to the independence of many nations in many parts of the world. Next slide, please. Let us now look at 20th century poetry. I talked about the two world wars, and that gave rise to what has probably been considered a new genre in poetry, in English poetry. No, I would say in poetry all over the world. And we call this poetry war poetry. Why am I using the word war poetry? Because this poetry was inspired by war. But my dear students, I want you to understand that this war poetry was different from the poems on war that had been written in earlier centuries. And what was the major difference? In earlier centuries, it was poets who had never experienced war, who were writing about the bravery, the courage, the heroism, the patriotism of soldiers. But in 20th century, suddenly, it was the soldiers themselves who were writing about poetry. If you have stood in the line of battle, if you've faced gunfire, if you've seen your companions die before your eyes, if you've had to leave the injured and go away because the enemy is after you, then the kind of poetry that is written is very different from the poetry that was written earlier when people sat in their drawing rooms and wrote about battle scenes. And therefore this poetry of Rupert Brooke and Owen, and even Yeats to some extent, is very different from the earlier poetry on war. There is a feeling of anti-romanticism in this period. Romanticism, my dear students, you know, the characteristic features of the Romantic age, where there was imagination, where there was subjectivity. There is anti-romanticism because we are moving towards realism. What one would say, let's call a spade a spade. If life is not beautiful, if life is ugly, let us have the courage to describe it. This is what 20th century poets believed, and this is what we see in the poetry of the 20th century. There was a concern with form. When I use the word form, I'm sure you know that we are talking about the structure of a poem. There were periods in English literature where form and structure took precedence over theme or content, like in the neoclassical age, in the poetry of Alexander Pope. But in the Romantic age, there was a total breakaway. And then the Victorian age, and now I'm talking about the 20th century, where there was this concern with form. And when I say concern with form, what I mean is that there was this ability, this capability, this talent to experiment with form. Most of the poets of the 20th century, whether you're thinking of Yeats or you're thinking of Eliot or you're thinking of Hopkins, did not accept the earlier accepted traditional forms of poetry. They experimented with form. There is a complexity to the poetry of the 20th century. Earlier, particularly in the Romantic age, we believed that poetry was for pleasure. One read poetry for entertainment. But Eliot and Yeats and Hopkins, the three names I'm mentioning again, wrote a kind of poetry which was no longer pleasure. It was hard work. It was cerebral. One had to make an effort to be able to understand and appreciate this poetry. It did not appeal to the senses. It did not appeal to the heart. It was complex. It was intellectual. The next point, as you notice, is the intellectual slant that the poetry of this period had. Let us now look at the writings of Eliot. My dear students, I have tried to put it in chronological order to give you an idea of what Eliot was writing. Let's have a quick look and see what it is that he was writing. What form did he write about? What form did he use in his writings? If you notice, he started writing at a very early age. He started writing when he was in his 20s. And what did he write? In the earlier ages, in the earlier period of his life, he wrote poetry. He wrote some of his best poems even as early as the first decade and the second decade. Go on till you come to 1921 to 25, and you notice that he wrote one of his most important poems, The Wasteland. I'll talk about it a little later. And then we move on and see that in the decade of the 1930s, he started writing criticism. What sort of a critic was he? Very different from Matthew Arnold, very different from the other critics that you have probably studied in literature, different from Sidney and Coleridge and Dryden and Wordsworth and so on and so forth. His criticism is different. And then you notice that in 1935 to 1939, that period, he started writing his plays. We talk about his plays as being important in 20th century literature because Eliot once again went back to what is called poetic drama. You remember the Elizabethan period, my dear students, where all drama was written in poetry. Remember, the novel or the prose form was yet to get a particular shape. The novel in the 18th century. Of course, there were essays before the poetic drama of Shakespeare and other Elizabethan dramatists. But in the 20th century, Eliot went back because he thought poetry was the best form in which to write drama. You have his plays like Murder in the Cathedral, which takes us back to the time of Beckett. You have plays like The Family Reunion or The Cocktail Party, which are based in the 20th century. And he continued to write till 1959, though of course he died in 1965. Let's look at the next slide, where I've quickly tried to tell you what were the three stages as a critic that we see in the writings of Eliot. Pick up any history of literature book, my dear students, and you will find that Eliot's contribution to English criticism, to literary criticism, is indeed great. You must have heard of terms like tradition and individual talent. You must have heard of terms like objective, correlative. But since I'm going to be talking about poetry, I will not be spending much time on talking about his critical views. However, I would like to talk about the three stages that we see in the criticism of Eliot. In the first stage, he seemed to be in an Arnold-like sweep, taking entire English literature in his purview and almost demolishing all the earlier dead poets. He wrote about many of the poets, which you will read when you look at Eliot as a critic. In the second stage, the second phase of his writing as a critic, we notice that there is an interest in political and theological issues. And in the third stage, he recognizes and reaffirms old preferences for values. I've already mentioned tradition and individual talent, where Eliot talks about the importance of tradition in every individual writer. But at the same time, he reminds us that the moment there is a writing, that writing becomes a part of tradition. So between tradition and individual talent, it is a constant give and take. No writer can write without tradition, and every writer's individual talent in the long run affects tradition. And of course, his importance in introducing poetic drama again in the 20th century. Let's look at the next slide, where I've just tried to give you an idea of his major poems. Trying to talk about the major poems of Eliot in such a short time is trying, as one would say in the proverbial way, is trying to take the entire ocean into a teacup. I know how impossible the task is, but what I hope to be able to do is to at least whet your curiosity so that you go back to the library, you go back to your classroom and try and find out what these major poems are. I've just mentioned a few poems, my dear students. The Wasteland, as I mentioned earlier, is one of his most important contributions to 20th century poetry. The wasteland. Please remember, it's not the Westland. We are not talking about a land in the western part of the world or the country. We are talking about this earth, which, according to Eliot, has become barren, has become incapable of producing anything. He's not talking about the earth per se. He's talking about human beings also, who seem to have lost their ability to think, to produce, to create. Both physically and mentally, they seem to have become totally barren. Of course, there's going to be more of it when we look at Gerontion. Isn't it interesting to imagine that a writer like T.S. Eliot was not very sure about The Wasteland when he first wrote it, and then he sent it to the great American writer Ezra Pound for his approval, for his suggestions. And Ezra Pound used the proverbial pen and slashed many parts and suggested changes. So the wasteland that we see today, that is available for us readers, is what has been corrected. And if to use computer language, has been deleted. Parts of it deleted by Ezra Pound. But the wasteland is certainly one important piece of writing of Eliot. What is the wasteland about? Impossible to give you in a sentence. The allusions, the anthropology, the myth, the readings of Eliot, his constant touch with Fraser's Golden Bough, his readings of Hinduism and Buddhism and Christianity and what have you, all that comes across in The Wasteland. A very difficult poem, but at the end of it, when he concludes with Om Shanti, one feels that this poem has really achieved something great. There are also other poems that one has to look at, like the love song of Alfred J. Prufrock. Can you imagine? He's writing about an old man. The persona is an old man. Eliot is only in his 20s, but he's writing about the experiences of a 60-year-old man. It's easy to write about a 20-year-old when you're 60 because you've already experienced it. But here you have a 20-year-old man writing about a 60-year-old. I want you to understand the imagination, the imaginative ability to create a persona who has experienced something which our young poet has not yet experienced. That is the greatness of T.S. Eliot as a poet. Irony plays a major role in most of the poems of T.S. Eliot. And that, my dear students, brings me to the first poem that I'm going to discuss with you today. Gerontion. The word itself is something which puts you into a tizzy because you don't know what it is all about. What is Gerontion? Is it a name? I've never heard the name, is what you're probably telling yourself. Yes, we have not heard the name because it is actually a Greek word. Geron means a small old man, and from that he has created the name Gerontion. What is the poem about? It is, let me begin with the form and tell you that it is a monologue. You all know the word dialogue, my dear students, but I'm sure you've heard of the monologue too. You've probably heard of a literary form called the dramatic monologue, which was made very popular by writers like Browning in the Victorian age. You have probably heard of how in the dramatic monologue, one speaker at a dramatic moment in his life is talking to others, but the others do not speak. How then do you know that there are listeners? Because the speaker, in the course of his monologue, gives you the reactions of the listeners too. So what is Gerontion? I just said it's a monologue. But my dear students, it's not a dramatic monologue. It is an interior monologue. That means the character, the persona, Gerontion, is speaking to himself. I'm sure you've seen this in modern movies where you have one character in black and the same character in a white dress. And this is what is happening inside the mind of the character. This is what the poet is trying to do. The entire form of the poem, as we go along with the poem, you'll see, is what is